Hey all, it's Dr. John McCrae. I'm a hair restoration specialist and I practice outside of Meridian, Idaho. I have patients come in all the time for all manner of hair loss. And the number one, surprise, surprise, complaint that I get is male pattern baldness. And I have the conversation I'm going to have with you today with literally every single patient that comes through the door that's suffering from male pattern baldness. So I thought, hey, what better way of explaining it than to just do a quick video on this subject. So what is male pattern baldness? Well, the male pattern baldness, also known as androgenic alopecia, if you want to get into the medical terminology of it, or we can dumb it down a little bit and call it testosterone mediated alopecia, which is a bit of a misnomer, which we'll explain here in a little bit. But it is a condition that roughly 50% of men in this country deal with at some point in their life. Sometimes it's early in their 20s, sometimes it's later in life. But it is just a condition where you start losing hair in a pattern. Okay. This is not a I lost hair here or I lost hair there. It is I lost hair in a pattern. Sometimes that pattern's up front, sometimes that pattern's in the back, sometimes it's in both, sometimes it's a George Costanza look where all you have left is a ring around the rosies of hair and squeaky clean bald on the top. But it comes in all shapes and sizes. And what it is, a genetic condition that makes you predisposed to a hormone in your body called dihydrotestosterone. So let's talk about the genetic condition of it. And we're going to talk about some wives' tales and things like that, that kind of some misnomers that are out there in society. So what are the genetic predisposition factors? We haven't identified all of the genes yet that we know of that are involved in male pattern baldness, but we have identified several of them. And we now know that these genes, if you inherit them, you can inherit them from either side of the family. There was an old misnomer that it has to come from your mom's side of the family. And while 100% it can come from your mom's side of the family, it can also come from your father's side of the family too. And I see that in practice. When a patient comes in and they're suffering from male pattern alopecia, I'll always ask them their family history. What does dad look like? What does grandpa look like? What does mom's dad look like? What does dad's dad look like? And we kind of can see familiar lines, okay? With almost always, there's a few times where somebody will come in and they're just one off. And when you are made, in the womb and, fertilization occurs, there's this thing in genetics called crossover, where a gene from my mom can cross over with a gene from a dad, and that's where variability happens. This is why every brother and every sister, they don't look identically the same, even though the genetic material from mom and dad are the same. That crossover mixes things up a little bit. So that's where the genetic variability comes from. You get this gene from somewhere in your family. And what does that gene do? That gene makes the follicle susceptible to a hormone in your body called dihydrotestosterone. Now, I've already alluded to that this is called androgenic alopecia or testosterone mediated alopecia, which is a little bit of a misnomer because it's not testosterone causing the problem, it's the byproduct of testosterone, which is called dihydrotestosterone. So you have testosterone, and a certain amount of it will get converted into dihydrotestosterone at the follicular level. What does that mean? A hair that comes out of your head, it has a root in the scalp called the follicle. The follicle is the little organelle that holds onto the hair, and it's very complicated. We'll probably talk about that in a later lecture. But at that level, at that tissue level, with people with the gene, they have more dihydrotestosterone at that follicular level than they would normally have. And that interferes with the follicle's growth cycle, okay? So it's not really I had hair one day and I didn't the next. A better way of looking at it is my hair miniaturized away. So what do I mean by that? You had a hair shaft coming out of your scalp that's this big, and then you shed it and it comes back this big. And then years go by and you shed it and it comes back this big, et cetera, until it's peach fuzz. And once it's peach fuzz, it sheds and it never comes back and you have loss of hair, okay? We don't understand why, but it's only the hair on the top of the head that's affected. And some people, it's just the front. Some people, it's the back. But inevitably, everybody has a little ring left over of resistant hair or dihydrotestosterone resistant hair. So I like to use the analogy of growing a garden. We want our hair to be a lush, dense garden. We want the follicles close together, and we want them nice and robust, so we have a nice robust hair. Dihydrotestosterone is like an herbicide that kills the roots of your garden. Okay. So that way, every season where winter comes and the garden dies down, and the next spring, the garden doesn't come in as well as before. Density's still there. Our growing season had garden plants that were this big, and then they shed and it comes back and the garden plants are this big. And then over the course of years, you get this withering away of the hair. The other interesting thing about dihydrotestosterone is there is a molecule that converts testosterone to dihydrotestosterone. That's called 5-alpha reductase. And that's actually the enzyme that's doing the work at the follicular level. There's a higher concentration of 5-alpha reductase in the follicles of the affected hair than there would otherwise be. So we have this enzyme, think of it like gasoline or a catalyst to, building up a fire. We have more of that on the affected hairs. So then what happens is we go through puberty as a young man. And then as we age, our testosterone raises. And with the testosterone levels going up, what happens? The byproduct goes up. And the byproduct's what's causing the problem. And I see it happen in all age ranges, but typically I see it in two instances if I were to classify who gets affected. People in their mid-20s. Why mid-20s? That's the highest testosterone you'll ever have in your life if you're a man. The mid-20s is when your highest level of testosterone is. And that's when hair loss really starts to kick into overdrive, okay? The next group I see the most hair loss in is middle-aged men that go on testosterone hormone replacement therapy, TRT. Why? They are going back to their 20-year-old self, or sometimes even more testosterone than they had at their 20-year-old self. And then all of a sudden, more testosterone, more byproduct, okay? So that's the process of how male pattern alopecia works, okay? Hair on the side is resistant. Hair on the top is susceptible to dihydrotestosterone. The challenging thing for me as a provider is when a patient comes through the door and I'm interacting with them, I don't know how bad their hair loss is going to be. So let's take a 20-something-year-old gentleman comes in, he's starting to see some temporal recession or maybe some miniaturization of the hair follicles in the crown. And he's like, doc, I want to keep my hair. What's going to happen to me? And the answer is, I don't know. So what I'll do is I'll get their family history and I'll say, okay, what did dad look like? What does the uncles look like? What does grandpas look like? And then from their family history, I try to ascertain what the end point is. So think of hair loss as a journey, okay? You start off in, let's call it Los Angeles, and you're going to end up in New York City. In your 20s, it's like you're in a Maserati and you're making that trip. Why? That's when your testosterone level is really high. Or if you're in your mid 40s and you get back on testosterone, you're in a Maserati and you're just flying to New York City. Where you start is pre-puberty. Where you end is what your family history typically shows how it's going to end. So if dad was squeaky clean bald and grandma or grandpa was squeaky clean bald and mom's dad was bald, and they all look very similar, you're probably going to end up like that, or there's a good likelihood onto it. And that's how we dictate care. If I know you're going to be super bad, I'm going to push for some really aggressive treatments. If it was just a little bit of recession, and then I'm looking at them today and they just have a little bit of recession, I'm like, you know what? We probably don't need to do much for you because it's probably not going to get that much worse. So the genetic history is how we dictate what kind of care we're going to get to. And we're not going to talk about how to treat male pattern baldness in this video, but in future videos, we're totally going to go down that path. So I hope you learned a few things today. Take this information, run with it, and take care.